Good morning. Welcome to this recorded Sunday for Easter, April 20th, 2025. My name is Bob Malone, and I'm the pastor here at Mount Vernon Presbyterian Church. On behalf of our entire church family, welcome. We hope that wherever and whenever you are listening, that you encounter the risen Christ as you listen to this message today. We have two scripture readings that we will be sharing when we gather together. The first one is the very familiar Easter story with which I know all of you are familiar. I'm going to read for you now our second passage, an unusual text for Easter Sunday. It's normally associated with the season of Advent, but I believe that Luke chapter 1 does have a message for us today. So listen now as I read from verse 67 through 79 for all that the Spirit is saying to you this glorious Easter day. John's father, Zechariah, was filled with the Holy Spirit and prophesied, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has come to his people and redeemed them. He has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, as he said through his prophets of long ago, salvation from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us, to show us mercy, mercy to our ancestors, and to remember the holy covenant, the oath sworn to our father Abraham, to rescue us from the hands of our enemies and to enable us to serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness before him all of our days. You, my child, will be called a prophet of the Most High, for you will go on before the Lord to prepare a way for him, to give his people the knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven, to shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet in the path of peace." Friends, this is the word of the Lord and the poetry of the faithful. Thanks be to God. Back in February, after our president and vice president's embarrassing Oval Office debacle with Ukrainian Prime Minister Volodymyr Zelensky, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen stepped up to the plate and assured both Zelensky as well as other world leaders that at least in Europe, opposition to Russia would remain solid and strong. It was the third anniversary of Putin's unwarranted and illegal invasion of a sovereign nation. And Frederiksen, the leader of one of the EU's smallest but most influential nations, said something that I have not forgotten, and that speaks powerfully to us today on this Easter Sunday. "The best thing about heroes," she said, "is that they always win at the end. And if they are not winning, then it's not the end. If they aren't winning, then it's not the end." What message is more important for us today than that? It's what Easter is all about. And so I'm going to modify Mette's words for the purpose of this sermon, but the spirit remains the same. If good isn't winning, If God isn't winning, then the story isn't over. If you don't have the words of Danes ringing in your heads the way I do, then these 9 words are worth remembering. If good isn't winning, then the story isn't over. Is it cheesy to have you say that with me out loud, right where you are? If good isn't winning, then the story isn't over. Throughout the season of Lent, here in worship, we have been looking at the various names and titles of Jesus. A teacher sent from God, an inviting bridegroom, the head of the church, the cornerstone of our lives. In your personal Lenten devotions, you've considered other names and titles: the Prince of Peace, the Good Shepherd, Emmanuel, God with us. Now, this morning, on this day of resurrection, with Zechariah, we are going to proclaim Jesus to be our salvation. Anyone out there need a little bit of salvation today? I know I do. In a world where war and violence, oppression and injustice appear to be everywhere, winning on every front, both in obvious places like Ukraine and Gaza, but also in less obvious places that we don't hear about every night on the evening news. Places like Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Sudan. People all around the globe are longing, pleading for salvation. Because right now, peace and justice are just not characters in their story. And so salvation, from all the evils of this world, well, the hero just hasn't yet arrived. Closer to home, the rampant fear and insecurity, both birthed in racism, sexism, and fascism, they are leading to all kinds of anxiety. And not just for federal workers, for immigrants and refugees, for people in minority communities. Anxiety is touching all of us. Neighbors all around us are wanting for some kind of salvation, simply because our stories, the stories that we are living, have far too many antagonists. Narcissistic bullies, afraid of things like inclusion and equity. Ill-informed fearmongers who are unable to see the great gift that is the world's diversity. Friends, who doesn't need a little bit of salvation today? For far too many people, Good Friday has come and it appears to be sticking around way too long. But it's Easter. Friends, it's Easter Sunday. And fortunately, we Christ followers, perhaps better than anyone, know that when good doesn't seem to be winning, the story isn't over. More than any other day throughout the year, Easter is about salvation. It's about God winning. It's about the realization that Good Friday doesn't stick around forever, and that eventually Easter morning does arrive. So I'm ending this sermon series titled, Who Do You Say That I Am?, with what I believe to be one of the most important names or titles given to Jesus: Horn of Salvation. That is the way the prophet Zechariah refers to him in the passage that I read for us. Horn of salvation. And I'm ending with that name because I just think we all need a little bit of salvation today. So let me offer a little bit of background on the passage. Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, was likely the author of the passage that I just read from Luke 1. And while Zechariah was a little slower than Jesus' mother, Mary, when it comes to acknowledging the work that God was going to do through them, Zechariah eventually does catch on. On the one hand, when the angel approached Mary to tell her about Jesus, her response was, "Okay, Gabe, if you say I'm going to have a baby, let's get going. Let's get this party started." But Zechariah, well, Zach was a little more skeptical. His response to the angel was a little bit more like, "A baby? Yeah, right. Do you know how old my wife is?" Now again, fortunately, in time, Zechariah does catch on. Blindness and muteness is quite convincing. But when he does catch on, when he does refer to Jesus, the one his son, John, is eventually going to prepare the way for, he refers to him as the horn of salvation. That's the name that he gives to Jesus in this morning's text. But why? Why the horn of salvation? Where does that come from? Well, Zechariah was a priest. And so he was very familiar with the temple. And in the temple, there was an altar. And on the altar, at the four corners, were carved horns. You see, throughout the Old Testament, horns were symbols of salvation. That is what the four horns on the altar symbolized: salvation. And what is particularly interesting about those horns on the altar is that they were considered to be places of refuge. All four corners, all four horns were places of refuge where people in any kind of trouble could seek asylum. And it was not at all uncommon for people accused of almost any crime to, whenever possible, flee to the altar in the temple, where they would grab one of those horns and in so doing escape whatever punishment may be coming their way. It was a place of safety and forgiveness, a place of grace and mercy. So, for example, in 1 Kings chapter 1, when Adonijah, the fourth son of King David, fails in his attempt to steal the throne from King Solomon, he flees to the altar and he grasps one of those horns because, well, that was where he could find safety and forgiveness. It was where he could find grace and mercy. It was where he could find salvation. And it was where a new and frankly better ending to his story could be written. And that is why this name for Jesus is so important. The horn of salvation. Our horn of salvation is Jesus. And so when we and when our world need a little bit of salvation, a little bit of grace and mercy, a little bit of hope that good might in fact one day win, we run to Jesus. It's what the story of Easter is all about. I'm even tempted to contend it's what the entire biblical story is all about. The story of resurrection is about good It's about God winning. It's about safety and security and salvation being available to all of us, regardless of what we might have done, regardless of all that might be going on in our world. It's a reminder that good can and does win. And that not even death can eradicate this transformative message that Jesus brought to our world. The story of resurrection is about God winning. Holy Week, and especially Good Friday, they are about good seeming to be lost. But in our story, in the Christian story, Good Friday does not get the last word. Good Friday does not get the final say, right? We know that. The story isn't over, because what happens 3 days later? On that first Easter Sunday, we discover that good does win, that God does win after all. And so, friends, that is the message that needs to be shouted from the mountaintop today, especially today. Because today, I just think we all need a little bit of salvation. We all need to be reminded that when it doesn't seem like good is winning, the story isn't over. We need to be shouting that message to the world whenever and wherever possible. In fact, we need to be shouting it so loudly that Kilmar Abrego Garcia can hear it all the way down in that El Salvadoran prison camp. We need to be shouting it so loudly that the women of Afghanistan, that the Uyghurs in China, that the children, the millions of children living on the streets of some of the world's largest cities, we need to be shouting this message so loudly that they can all hear it, that they can all see it, so that everyone who is stuck in the Good Friday of life knows beyond a shadow of doubt that Easter is coming, and that their story is not yet over. The ending has not yet been written. As a Matthew 25 congregation, we know here that people of color and the poor need to hear this message. And more importantly, they need to know that we are their allies. And that in spite of executive orders coming out of the White House, diversity, equity, and inclusion, those efforts all around this nation are vital as we seek to dismantle structural racism and eradicate systemic poverty. And so because we want to be a church, because we want to be a faith community where all really are welcome, this is the message that we need to be sharing. Your story isn't over just yet. As a More Light congregation, as part of the covenant network of Presbyterians, we also know that our siblings in the LGBTQIA community need to hear this story shouted as much as possible. Because even though it may seem at times for them as though goodness is losing, they are truly seen here. They are truly heard here, because we know that their story isn't over. We talk a lot about collisions these days at MVPC. And these collisions that we've been talking about with our community, they are about our shouting to young families, to everyone that God is bringing our way, that regardless of the struggles in their lives right now, their story is not over. And in the end, God will win. Because God always wins. And if God isn't winning, then say it. Say it with me. If God isn't winning, then the story isn't over. You see, this winning that I'm talking about, it's not just something we're going to experience in some life to come. The reality of the Easter story is that we can experience new and abundant life right here, right now. Salvation is more of a mindset, something that we're dealing with as a present reality, more than some mansion we're going to visit in the clouds. And if we're not yet experiencing this salvation here and now, then we just need to know that the story isn't over. If you're suffering, if you're struggling today, then the Easter story, the Easter message is especially for you. Now, please know that I am well aware of how privileged this message may sound to some. I mean, how easy is it for someone like me to say that if good isn't winning, then the story isn't over, right? I mean, what do I know about suffering? I'm a white, heterosexual Christian man who lives in America. Russian tanks have never rolled into my neighborhood. Israeli bombs have never reduced my community to rubble. I haven't had a parent or a spouse or a child deported. And even today, in the climate in which we find ourselves, I don't worry about losing my job because I openly support DEI and am not afraid to take a stand against the powers that be. I'm not a black teenager getting pulled over for nothing, nor am I a young Asian woman being told to sit down, be quiet, and do what I'm told. How easy is it for someone like me to offer words of hope? Words that to some of you may just be that, words. How dare someone like me tell people of color who have suffered the evil of racism for over 400 years to have hope, that their story isn't over? What right do I have to tell the immigrant or the refugee to be patient because their story isn't over? Well, I don't know, but I do. I do dare to share this message this day because I have the audacity to hope. And because I know in my bones that even while waiting for good to win, for God to win, we are not alone and we have one another. And I know that together we can find strength and support among our siblings in this faith. So you better believe that I'm going to share this message boldly and loudly. You better believe that I am going to shout this message from the mountaintops. In the good company of Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, with John the Baptist's dad, Zechariah, and with the women who went to that tomb that very first Easter morning so long ago, with all of them, we all need to boldly and loudly name Jesus as our salvation. And we need to boldly and loudly shout to all this world that if God isn't winning, then the story isn't over. Friends, may you find hope, great hope, in those words today. Christ is alive. Your story isn't over. Have a great day, and I do look forward to seeing you right back here next Sunday morning. Until then, friends, peace.